We're going to start with You Are the Vine. You are the vine. Wait a second. You are the vine. We are the branches. Keep us abiding in you. You are the vine. We are the branches. Keep us abiding in you. And we'll grow in your love. And we'll grow in your name, that the world will surely know that you have power to heal and to save. You are the vine. We are the branches. Keep us abiding in you. You are the vine. We are the branches. Keep us abiding in you. Let's pray. God, our life is in you, and we're so grateful that your presence and your life is in us. As we study today the way that you relate to us and how you speak to us, we ask that we would experience your presence in our hearts, and that you would inspire our thoughts and encourage us as we are on this path that you have given to us. We're grateful for your love and care. In your name we pray. Amen. All righty, plugging along here. So we have Paula, Maria, Judy, and Joy joining us here this morning online. So welcome everybody, and everybody who's sitting here as well. We're in chapter 5, and we're going to start with probably a few pages over from where we left off. And the beginning sentence of this paragraph starts with the words all notions of social sin. If anybody who has the book here with you, if you find the page number, you're welcome to share it with us. I'm online, and
No page
my
numbers.
pages don't really make sense.
I'm on page 43, but I'm on the 10th anniversary edition.
Okay, 10th anniversary edition 43. All notions of social sin, offenses against the common good, the family, the neighborhood, the rest of creation, or the future, were all forgotten in favor of a few, quote, hot sins, and an endless laundry list of trivia that we barely felt guilty about. All right, and welcome Diane joining us as well. So let's look at this again. So we're in step 5. We're talking about how we're admitting that we're powerless. Probably, if we get to this place of admitting that we're powerless, sometimes it could be one particular shortcoming that we deal with, one particular challenge, one particular addiction. That could be one of the reasons why we engage in the 12 steps. Sometimes that's one of the reasons that might bring somebody to church or bring somebody into a community for support. One particular brokenness or shortcoming, or so sometimes it's one. it could be that occasionally somebody feels like it might be that one, but that one was just kind of the last straw. There's just a whole group of things in life that feel out of control. So that's one thing. So we come into this 12-step saying we're powerless, we fall short, we're broken, we need help. So we're powerless, we need help, and then we find a God who is able, and we surrender our lives to God, and then we start to examine more closely what it is about our life that we want to improve or experience healing from brokenness or overcome an obstacle or deal with an addiction. And just because of the way we're wired as human beings, we probably more easily recognize our personal shortcomings. And then if we recognize what's happening with other people, we recognize other people's shortcomings. Sometimes that's the easiest thing to do, is to recognize other people's personal shortcomings. That's
splinter in the eye.
That's the speck in somebody else's eye. That's the easy one to find out. That guy's a jerk, I can't stand her. But usually we know exactly what it is about the person, that shortcoming. And then hopefully if we become mature enough, we recognize, we've got some stuff going on too inside of us. We might say, well, I don't have the same problem they do.
Not as
but
bad as him.
Not as bad. So that's the other. This is a different, when we talk about social sins, this is, maybe this is a step further, or this is our way of understanding the impacts, our collective impacts of the shortcomings that we share together. So when we talk about social sins, this is not something that's just affecting my life, but it's affecting the lives of the people around me. And then what we also find that is a challenge for us to face is that we can collectively fall short in certain categories. So we collectively start to sin together. All right? In the scriptures, when any prophet comes on the scene, usually they're addressing social sins. They're addressing the group, the community. They're not picking out one particular person in the group and saying, you need to change. That does happen rarely, but occasionally. An example of that would be where Nathan goes to King David and says, you're falling short. And he points out his adultery and murder with Bathsheba and Bathsheba's husband. So that would be the prophet saying, your sin will have this impact, and you need to get together with God and figure out how to fix this, because it's a problem. But most of the prophets that we see, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and all the minor prophets, they're usually talking to the group. They're talking to Israel, they're talking to Judah, and they're saying, you're not taking care of the poor. You're not taking care of the orphan and the widow. That's a phrase that's used often, because to be an orphan or to be a widow, in those times there were not social programs to help support somebody who's in that situation. You had to be taken into somebody's home.
That'd be like a death sentence.
Right. Because if you were an orphan or widow, it's likely you'd have no access to resources, no status in the community, and you'd be an outcast. So people that were completely disconnected from community. So when the prophet comes and says, you're not taking care of these people, this is a part of your covenant with God, is to take care of the people that don't have anybody to take care of them.
Is that the era where they made the widow marry her brother-in-law?
Right. That's why that law was put into place, so that the widows would have somebody to take care of them. That's back in the good old days of polygamy. That's back in the day when being family meant something very different than it does today. So, yes, that was one of the reasons, was so that that person would be taken care of and would have a family. And the other reason was it was very important, and this is more important in agrarian societies, which is, most of human history. And it's really not until recently that we have the Industrial Revolution and urban society. In agrarian societies, you need as many people as possible. And so that's why everybody had so many kids, because you don't go hire workers, because that's going to cut into the money that you make or the resources that you have. So that's why people would just have big families. I've heard it said you always had as many as you could, and you only found out that you had too many when you had that one extra one that you're like, oh yeah, we went too far. But until then, you keep going. So when I'm doing genealogy and looking back at previous generations, it's not uncommon to see 7, 8, 9, 10
Yeah.
kids in a family.
Yeah.
And it's not uncommon to get remarried is not uncommon. Usually it's because the spouse passes away. But just looking back at some of my own family tree stuff, I've seen several times where you have a big family, the wife dies, and then you have a younger wife, and then she has more kids, so the family just keeps getting bigger. So, that's one of the ways that they would take care of the widow. Would be, it's called levirate marriage. So you'd marry into your husband's family. The other way that Israel was talked about their social sins was that they were turning to other gods. They were worshiping in the way that the neighbors of their community were worshiping, which was not Yahweh, was not the covenant with Abraham. And when the masses started to do that, when they started to mix religiously, then the prophet came in and said, you're going to have to turn things around. And always the prophet comes in, it's not really a threat, but it's more of a just reminding people, if you go down this path, there's consequences. And there's elaborate ways that the prophet would, usually they're very threatening ways that the prophet would describe these things, just talking about all the bad things that are going to happen. So when we look at social sins today, what we're looking at is how do we collectively fall short? And it's probably harder for us in our society to look at things this way because we lean toward individualism. That's a part of our culture, and that's a part of what we say is important, is the individual life, your individual freedom to live. That's what's important. And yes, you are a part of a group, but remember, you're an individual as well. Other cultures, even today, the individual doesn't stand out so much. It's your identity is within in the collective. Right. So this paragraph here is talking about how this is probably for us, in our society and in our culture, we tend to focus on a few particular sins and shortcomings. And the church in America oftentimes would focus on personal sins that had to do with health or sex. Those were the two things. So health, a lot of churches would say no drinking, no smoking, and everything else. There's a couple songs like "Don't Drink, Don't Cuss." I'm not gonna remember. But it's like finding a girl, and you need to find a girl that doesn't drink and cuss and smoke and something like that. So
It's your old song.
don't go for a fun girl, go for the boring ones. That's the message. So we focus on these individual things. The denomination that I grew up in took it a step further. There were restrictions on meat and restrictions on caffeine, no caffeine.
We
So
weren't supposed to drink, dance, do anything really.
no drinking, no dancing.
No.
Yeah, dancing was a big thing too, because we know what that leads to.
Yeah.
That leads to the other category. So then there's sexual sins. So there's there's being faithful to your marriage covenant, but then there is the issue of what about all those years before you're married? So that's become, for some religious circles, like conservative Southern Baptists or something like that, this is where these practices like the promise ring comes in, where people, they say, I'm going to wear this ring and I'm going to abstain from sex until I'm married. They never talked about this when I was growing up in this setting, which was basically you were required to be abstinent from all sexual activity until you were married. Here's the tricky part, and they didn't talk about this tricky part when I was growing up, because it probably would have given people excuses to rethink the whole thing. But biologically speaking, a boy that goes from puberty to his peak of sexuality, in terms of like the hormones going crazy and the just this innate desire to have an interest in sex, peaks at like 18 years old. So it just takes off like crazy, and then it just like slowly plateaus for a long time. For women, that peak comes around mid-30s. So in some ways, what you had happening, if you're trying to get these people pre-marriage to abstain, you just are trying to put a leash on the boys or keep them behind bars until they're able to get married. But at the same time, if you want people to be in a loving, committed relationship, and that's what marriage is, then people need to know how to have relationships. They need to know how to be friends and how to trust one another. They need to know how to be intimate. And so that's the tricky part, is the average age of marriage today is like 30. So you're going to go from adolescence to 30 years old when you're physically, biologically peaking in your interest for this, and you're going to say, no, just don't do it. That's the problem. Now, this was not an issue as far back as 3 or 4 generations ago, because people were getting married when they were 14 and 16 years old. And so I don't know that, I haven't heard of a solution to deal with that, or a game plan for that, other than abstain. There are some approaches that they're just more involved and complex, and they require lots of conversations and trust between parents and children and stuff like that. But this became those issues of drugs and alcohol, or the way that we treat our body, and then sexuality. Those things, the sins of the flesh, those things became such a focus from the church, because they recognized that it was a significant issue to deal with. But oftentimes this, along with like using bad language or whatever, those personal things, those became the only thing that we thought about when we talk about sin. If you I'm watching this documentary on a big church that kept a lot of things secret for a long time. And anytime that we see in the news a minister has a moral failing, what's it going to be? What are the chances that it's going to be about sex? There's very, very high chances. We just assume if we see moral failure, so-and-so resigned because of moral failure, it's usually not that person was stealing money from the church. I mean, sometimes it is, but usually it's when we say moral failings. And we don't talk about how this minister or this church fell short in terms of social sins. They lived in a community surrounded by people in need, and they didn't do anything. That's a shortcoming, and that's what we're supposed to be all about. So there's a call here to, when we're doing this inventory and we're talking about, ultimately we end up talking about our selfishness, either our individual selfishness or our collective selfishness. How have we ignored the impact that we have on other people? So keep in mind that it's not just a narrow category of sin.
Look what the Catholic Church has gone through in exposing that kind of thing. They really had a tough time.
Yes.
They're not
Yes.
alone, but they're the one that was in the news so much.
Right. Yeah, the essentially the issue of child molesting has been exposed, yes, in the church, but also in other organizations, that have taken care of children. I worked in, for 4 summers after high school, I worked at a summer camp. And I would go and we'd live at this summer camp for like 2 months. And so it's a bunch of kids that are either older in high school or college age, mostly that are in charge of these kids that are coming in for a week or so. And we didn't think anything of it at the time, but the responsibility that you're placing, I was a counselor, and I think 20 years old. So I'm 20 years old, and I'm responsible for 12 to 16 kids. And one summer camp was 8 and 9-year-olds. So I'm in charge of 12 to 16, 8 to 9-year-olds. So we're living in the same cabin. We're going to meals. Everybody goes to meals in the same cafeteria together. We're going off to morning activities, afternoon activities, evening activities. So we're always like sending people out, and then we always come back and do a roll call,
Was it co-ed?
It was co-ed, yeah. The individual cabins were separated, but the activities were all co-educational activities. And looking back now, like if my son, who's now graduated from high school, if he wanted to go work at a summer camp, I would have to have like a real trust in that organization and a trust in him, because there's just so much liability at stake. But we say like, oh, we're making a big deal about it. Well, what happened is we really weren't fully paying attention to a lot of bad stuff that was happening for decades and decades.
It's not a big deal until it is.
Right. So, yeah, that's an issue. So when we're looking at other types,
I like the next paragraph after your highlighted one. The half of all, go back a page. Half of all
confessions are about missing mass on Sunday.
Yeah,
Right.
That whole paragraph.
We used to say that hearing 90% of confessions was like being stoned to death with marshmallows.
Yeah.
For the recipients, it was like a Saturday night shower whereby we could seek moral purity much more than moral maturity. We were encouraged, according to form, confessions, and according to form, absolutions. While many Catholics went pretty much as greedy, materialistic, enemy-hating, unfaithful, and warlike as everybody else.
Yeah.
All right, so this is, when we're looking at the hot button topics, are we looking at, we don't talk as church in our culture about greed really very much, unless we're pointing the finger at the people that have a cajillion dollars. We may do that, but we don't look at ourselves. And we may not be a part of the 1% here in our country, but in relationship to all the people in the world today, we're top 5% probably,
Yeah,
maybe top 2%, top 1% in terms of our income.
yeah.
And how much do we look at the way that we've set up our systems of relating and exchanging, and how did we get to this place? There's always been disparities. You know, the king always had this, and everybody else is down in the mud. And you know, maybe today it's a little bit better. Maybe the poorest. I have read and heard that the level of poverty today is better than the level of poverty was. The lowest levels of poverty today are better than the lowest levels of poverty, you know, say 100 years ago. But there's still I think there's actually more disparity now between the very richest and the poorest
Oh, yeah.
than there has been before, just because of the way that we live today with technology, globalization. People have the capacity to be richer than they ever were before. You know, even the richest king wasn't as rich as the richest person today. So, but again, it's easy to point at, and we know the names. We know a couple names of the richest because we see them in the news all the time. We say like greedy, greedy, greedy. You're a bad person. But again, we have to look at the society that we're a part of, and we have to acknowledge that in a lot of ways, these people are regarded as our heroes. And everybody has their story. Oh, you know, I grew up and I didn't have that much, but I came up with this idea and I had this thing, and now look at, you know, we're like, yay, wish I could be like that. We were talking about the lottery earlier. So we think it's okay. I mean, we it's kind of a fun thing to play. Oh, let's play a game. You know, let me throw my ticket in and just see what happens if I get $1 billion or not. But it's like, would you keep it if you won it?
No, not all of it.
Not all of it.
Money.
$1 billion is enough to keep some, and
Yeah, but you're gonna
Well, I
lose,
can't even comprehend that kind of money.
you're
right.
gonna lose so much of
When-
it in taxes. So
When is the last time we heard a story about somebody that won the lottery and they gave everything away? They gave everything away to charitable.
that don't happen.
I've heard that story, oh gosh, it had to have been maybe 40 years ago. A man in Fort Pierce won like $100,000 in a lottery, which was quite a bit of money as today. And when he figured out what the taxes were, he gave it all to his church.
Oh, okay.
He said, no, I'm not paying the taxes.
Right.
But I was gonna say it was,
My neighbor won it, and she was telling us, well, how did you tell him? She heard it on the radio that she had the number. She was feeding the baby with the bottle, and pretty soon the milk was going all over the place. And her mother called, she called her mother. She said, are you sitting down? What, you won the wild lottery? And she said, in fact, I did.
Wow.
Amazing.
Right.
Never know.
So the gentleman in Fort Pierce gave it away to the church, or
yeah, he gave
right?
it all to the church because they
Oh,
wanted
that's
to pay
very
taxes. No, that's okay. But what would come to me would be like, okay, so we talked about the sin of commission, so now there would be the sin of omission, what I could do with the money, or
Right.
what I can also do, like with my time, you know, he talks about, you know, missing mass on Sunday, and,
Right.
you know, what can I do with my time and my resources?
Right,
you know?
right. There's always, I mean, there's always room for improvement, for sure. There's always room for improvement. What I have found is that, because the church that I grew up in, I remember experiencing a lot of guilt and shame around these topics of sinfulness. And that, I think, was used as a motivator to keep people from sinning, was that you would feel guilty and you would feel shame. And I went back for like a baptism to this old denomination that I was a part of, and Ian was young, and we went to church with a friend who was having their kids baptized, and the children's story was about how the kids it talked about something like weeds in the sidewalk, and it talks about how all the kids have weeds in their life, and they need to make sure that they take care of the weeds, and the weeds are sin, So I'm like, oh geez, this is why I'm not here. I mean, okay, so that was one.
Thank you for
and it was like, watch out for those weeds, There's this kind of ominous warning, fear, I guess, that like these things are going to overcome you and bad stuff is going to happen. And then we went on to, the kids went on to the other room to do kind of the rest of the hour together. And I went and sat in just to kind of just to see what it was going to be like before I totally let him go. And the topic was reverence. And I remember reverence being this favorite topic when I was growing up as a kid. And it was this idea of when you come to church, you have to be reverent. So essentially what that meant is kids need to shut up and slow down and do what you're told. That's what being reverent is. Because if you're too loud and you're laughing too much and you're running around and you're having too much fun, then that's not being reverent. And we don't do that. We don't come to have fun or to be loud. We come to be quiet. We come to be meditative. We're like organized, and so this idea of reverence was just like pounded into us as kids. Now after services, because my dad was the pastor, we're always the first to show up and the last to leave. And every Saturday, every time we had church, they had a potluck every single week, and it just rotated like who was in charge of it. So it's like you had to stay not just for church, but you had to stay for potluck. And you know how long it takes for people to eat and finish eating and cleaning up. So needless to say, kids that had to stay were like, you're bored out of your mind and you're just waiting for these adults to be done. And so what we would do is once we were done eating is we would sneak off, and it was a pretty big church. We would just go run down the hallways. And if we ever got caught, it was like, you're not being reverent. And it's like, there's nobody around here. It's and we've got all this energy and you're not giving us anything to do. So anyway,
Well,
that
we
was,
have a Seventh-day Adventist church by us. And on Saturday, I think they get started about 9 o'clock, and usually by 2 in the afternoon, you'll see some of the cars start to leave the parking lot.
Sometimes 3 and 4 o'clock.
And then
Wow.
usually by 3, 4 o'clock, it's like, oh, okay, we're done here.
wow. That's a little longer than it was for us, but yeah, so this idea of shame and guilt, it starts early. We recognize what an impact it can have, but what I found personally as I grew up and I'm dealing with these issues of sinfulness and how do we deal with that, I found that personally guilt and shame was not effective. It just made me angry.
Yeah.
It just because it made me feel like, there are some things that I'm still working on, or I'm still trying to figure out what I think about them in terms of like how to live my life, and to have somebody constantly watching me and telling me that I'm less of a person until I can get my act together. I was like, that's not going to work for me. So I've pretty much, we're using this term sin as we're talking about these steps, just because it's a commonly used word in Christianity. But I got to a point pretty early on in my adult life where I essentially decided to throw this word away, because I just think it's been misunderstood and misused. And I think that we are created to grow, and we're created to experience transformation and healing. And when we view these shortcomings or these growing edges in our life as sin, and you have to get it right if you're going to stop sinning, this would be the equivalent of getting angry at a child because they don't understand how to do calculus.
Yeah.
So it's going to take a while for them to figure out. They got to learn to add and subtract and multiply and divide and do algebra and all that before they can even get to the place where they start to do calculus. And we don't shame kids that are like at a stage where they can do addition but they can't yet do division. We don't shame them, but we say, no, you're growing. Work on this step. This is the step to work on now. So I think a lot of this stuff that we say is sinfulness is an issue of maturity. It's an issue of you're still growing.
Yeah.
So I think using shame and guilt for those things is it's just not helpful. If we look at somebody who's committed a sin that we would definitely classify as a sin, like say murder. If somebody gets to the place in their life where they murder, if you backtrack the story, I guarantee you're going to find shortcomings in all these other areas where the person did not grow up. And that's what leads to murder. Because if somebody grows in all these other areas, that's not going to be an option for them. That's going to be the furthest from their mind. Now, we always say everybody has the capacity or whatever, but I feel pretty confident I'm going to make it to the end of my life without murdering somebody. I mean, yeah, I get angry, but I don't get to the place where I want to plot to take somebody's life. So I can't say, oh, that's just because I'm a normal person that I feel that way. No, I think it is because thanks to my parents, my upbringing, the community around me, I learned how to grow up as a human being to a place where I can be healthy enough to where I'm not going to murder, And I don't, stealing is a broad spectrum of stealing. I mean, stealing a car is one thing, but then there's like
Stealing a candy bar?
there's stealing a candy bar with technology. There is like, I downloaded this song and I couldn't find where to pay for it, but I found it and I downloaded it, and technically I stole it, I guess, because I didn't give money to whoever I needed to give money to. But that's another thing that is like, I'm not trying to go through life thinking, how can I steal things? And that's because, again, the way that we grew up. So if we can probably do this with the sins that we deal with, or the shortcomings we deal with in our lives, at whatever present stage we are, if we can figure out how to backtrack what's connected with that desire or that shortcoming, we can probably find we need some healing or we need some growth in some other areas of our life. So let's look at another one that might be a little bit more common that we might all do, and that is, how often do we yell and scream at somebody? Right? I mean, really let them have it, yell and scream at somebody. So Is that sinful? Well, is there a better way to deal with it? Probably. There's probably a way to deal with it that would be better for you and better for the other people, and that you could still get what you're looking for. So, but that's a trickier one to find out, what is it that makes me feel like it's okay to yell and scream at people? And what skills do I not have, or do I need to work on, so that when things happen that make me want to scream, I can choose other methods to get what I want without resorting to something that really is, it's just more damaging. It's hard to, if you have a yelling fight with somebody, it's going to take a while to kind of restore what you did, because you've kind of crossed over just civil and loving interactions with,
Well, when you
with
yell
one
and
another.
scream, you also can say things that you don't mean or really shouldn't say.
Right. It moves from solving a problem, a specific problem,
Creating another.
and then it moves into, I'm just going to hurt you.
Yeah.
I'm going to do what I can to hurt you. So I'm going to say things that hurt you, that belittle you, that remind you of your own shortcomings, or, there's things
Yelling
like
and
that.
screaming is taking the easy way out. It requires no thought.
Right.
Whereas if you want to negotiate with someone and try and solve a problem, then you have to actually use your brain.
Well, I screamed
Yeah.
at my 3 boys all the time until I got a little girl. And I started to scream at her one time. She was only maybe 3. And she went white and she backed up against the counter. And I thought, what am I doing?
Mm-hmm.
I will never raise my voice to you again. And I never have.
Mm-hmm.
That was a shock when I saw
Right.
what happened to her because I was
Right.
screaming.
And as adults, if we're screaming at somebody and they're screaming back to us, we're not motivated by the little girl and that reaction, because we don't see it. But it's possible that inside an adult that's yelling back at us, they're also afraid and they're also being hurt.
Yep.
So those are the things that we could have work on. Patty, do you?
Yeah, I was just thinking of so many things, and I think it's true. Hurt people, you know? And so many times how we react, and again, it's reacting as opposed to responding, a lot of times what we do. And as humans, I think we might know the right thing to do, but we don't always do it in the heat of the moment. And products of our environment. It's kind of like I learned earlier on the 7 deadly sins, which I don't think of them that now, the one I was actively doing this step, and I don't remember all of them, but like murder is the worst part of like angry, getting upset, feeling guilty, and then that's taking it to its furthest degree or whatever, and I think, if we don't learn how to, like when I was growing up, good girls don't get angry.
Yeah.
That's a natural emotion. There's nothing wrong with it. It's important to feel it, to feel our feelings. It's what we do with them.
Right.
And,
Right. You're right. That's important. That's very important, that all of the emotions that we experience, there's a cause and effect taking place inside of us when we experience emotions. And we're processing life when we experience emotions. And at the same time, once we experience an emotion, it's like a little fire is created with that emotion. And it is possible for us to throw a whole lot of gasoline on top of that once the fire gets started. You know what I mean? Instead of, as soon as the anger fire starts, it's time to kind of step back, count to 10. And what makes it even more complicated is that, in my experience, usually it's not really only one thing that would lead you to yell at somebody else. It's a straw.
Yeah.
And it might be that it's the last straw between you and that person, or it could be that it's just the last straw in your day or in your life. You've got all this stuff building up, and then finally you snap. And I've done that before and just like really regretted it, where it's like I will say or do something and I realize like it's just this accumulation of stress and anger and disappointment and
And a lot of it will have
and
nothing to do
it's
with
a
the
lot of
person you're angry with.
unresolved things, and you just are in the wrong time in the wrong place to get yelled at. Oftentimes I think with people that live together, you get yelled at just because you're the closest person. And somebody's going to get yelled at, and you just happen to be there. But if I had a thought about what you were saying, Patty, about anger and murder and their connection. If you think about it this way, when you get on the path of anger and you feed it, you may not make it all the way to murder, but you're on that road, and you may stop and turn around. Or you may never go that far, but it's the same road, And so there's nothing wrong with the feeling that puts you there. It's your decision. Am I going to walk down that road, or am I going to experience and be like, no, I don't want to go down that road.
It's learning. Yeah, awareness is a wonderful thing, I think, but by itself it's nothing if you don't do something with it. And it's, I think when we become aware of behaviors or become conscious of things that I don't think I like that, or I don't want to be that person, or I don't care, I'm doing it anyway because
Right.
I don't care if I hurt somebody. But
If we can, when we do experience it, if we can take a step back and figure out what is it that got me here? What was the last thing I remember before everything went red? What's the last thing? So, and then is it possible to take the step before that? What else was happening? And then what was happening before that? If we can take the time to figure that out, I think that's what this is about us taking a look inside at how life is affecting us, how we're choosing to have an attitude toward different things that happen in our life, the decisions that we're making in our life. So, sometimes when I've experienced this, when I've gotten angry and yelled or did something to somebody else, sometimes if I look back, I did something that I was not really happy with myself about. But I didn't sit down and have a conversation with myself at that point to kind of figure it out. And so that frustration I ended up taking out on somebody else.
You've already committed the act by the time you have time to look back and think, oh, what led me to that? Or what's leading me to this? Because you've already done it.
Right. And that's where if we get more comfortable saying I'm sorry, it can be a big help.
Yeah.
And it's not comfortable. I remember as soon as Ian could talk, he never liked to say I'm sorry.
No.
He refused.
Nope.
He absolutely refused. And how do you can you force someone to say I'm sorry? Because that's not
It doesn't mean anything.
that's not what I'm sorry is about. I'm sorry is about coming to the realization of what you've done and asking for forgiveness. So that's the other part about living these steps, is that we have to go from being dependent on other people telling us how to think, what to do, how to respond, and say I'm sorry. If we don't say I'm sorry until we get caught, if we don't say I'm sorry until we've hurt somebody really, really, really bad, there's probably a lack of confidence there, a lack of self-confidence, that it's okay to say I'm sorry, and you're still a good person, and you're still a human like everybody else, but it actually is a sign of strength and courage
Yeah.
to say to another person, I'm very sorry that I said what I said and to hurt you. And then just a little side note on apologies. Don't use the word if
Yep,
in an apology.
yep.
Write that one down.
I'm sorry if I hurt you. If you're apologizing, you're taking responsibility. You're not having a conversation about hypotheticals.
No,
Because a conversation about hypotheticals is not an apology.
no.
I am sorry that and then you tell the person what you acknowledge that you did, and then you open yourself to say, I may not realize what I did. You know, can you please tell me how what I did affected you? And then to say, I am sorry that when I did this, I hurt you, and I did these things. That's an apology. The other thing is, don't add the word but to an apology. Because that's not an apology. Because then you're just back to square one.
Cancels it all
I'm
out.
sorry that I yelled at you, but what you did to me is, see, that's not an apology either. So an apology is simply you admitting that you're wrong and you're taking responsibility for it. It doesn't require that somebody else say that they're sorry too. And it doesn't require that somebody else even know or acknowledge or whatever. That's their issue. Now, if you need to tell somebody that they hurt you too, it's better to have that in a different conversation, because if you tie the two together, it just looks like you're making an excuse for your behavior.
Yeah,
You know, or you're telling them it's their fault. I'm sorry I hit you, but you shouldn't have said that to me. You know, like, no, what should have happened is if somebody said something to you that hurt you, you should tell that person, what you just said to me right now really hurt me. And then don't demand any apology, because a demanded apology is not an apology and it's not going to fix. You leave it up to the other person. These are, it's funny because these are kind of the basics of communication and good relationships, but oftentimes we don't learn these things
until
very
much later.
early on.
The other
in life.
thing with saying I'm sorry is you get the person who will constantly say, I'm sorry, oh, I'm sorry, oh, I didn't mean, I'm sorry. And
That's something
that
else.
means nothing, you know, it's like.
Right.
I
Yeah,
mean,
and I don't know exactly, that's a unique situation that needs to be resolved in a different way.
That person's got a whole nother set of issues going on that
Usually at the heart of that is the person in a way is saying they are sorry that they exist. You know,
Yeah.
I'm sorry that I exist and I'm a bother to you. I mean, that is because I'm aware of that. A person oftentimes is apologizing for who they are,
yeah,
you know, or they feel like there's this awareness of sinfulness, but they're not cutting themselves a break. That, look, you don't start doing math in first grade with calculus, right? So you shouldn't feel guilty or ashamed that you don't know how to do calculus in first grade. So it's probably a situation where somebody feels that they were always told that they were wrong, that they weren't enough, and oftentimes there were severe consequences that person would suffer for just growing up
Yeah.
and fumbling along the way. And so maybe somebody's gotten used to being yelled at or threatened, or they're used to consequences, and I'm sorry was a way to kind of diffuse that. But then if you just say I'm sorry for everything, I mean, you could, because we can always do better. I mean, I could be doing a better job here this morning. You guys could be doing a better job with your mornings. I mean, we can all, if we,
I'm sorry, Rob.
There's a kid-sized person who will never say I'm sorry.
right.
You have people like that as well.
Exactly. A person who never admits, who never apologizes is something else. And what's there likely is an insistence on maintaining power and control. Because admitting that you're sorry or saying that you're sorry is a weakness that could be exploited.
It's a shortcoming.
It's something that could be taken advantage of. So if I never say I'm sorry, then, I mean, I had some faces pop into my head of people that never say they're sorry. But, you're often encouraged, well, we do it. There are more apologies today, public apologies. But I don't know, it's a
Too many of
trend.
the apologies
It's a
in
trend.
public have the word if or but in them also.
Well,
Yeah. Or there is the thing with kind of political correctness where people are asked to apologize because they have been offensive in a politically correct way. I think a lot of times in those situations, an apology can be issued, but you kind of wonder if it's just like a requirement by that person's public relations
Yeah.
committee that just required them to do that. I don't know. I mean, that's the whole thing too, is like you have to trust that a person really is apologetic.
I wrote your apology sign here.
Right. Yeah. All right, let's keep going here. In the last couple of minutes, we have step 5, tried to remedy these deficiencies in its own honest and practical way. It returned to confession to all 3 levels, God, self, and at least one other human being. It returned the mystery of forgiveness to where Jesus first offered it, to peer confession and peer counseling. All right, so this is, in this step, we're talking about admitting to God, admitting to self, admitting to another human being. So this is where it's important to know who the apology needs to be made toward, who has been affected by the shortcoming. So sometimes we might say, God, I've offended you, or God, I've done something against you. I kind of got my own issue with that. I think, again, looking back, I think God knows my heart. I think that God helps me to grow. I don't feel like that God is using guilt and shame as the primary motivator to make it work. I don't think that God is using threats, physical, spiritual, eternal threats to my being a good person. Now, I will say that there's nothing wrong with some good, healthy guilt. You want that. You want to have a conscience that tells you that you're not doing the right thing. You want that. But you don't want it to be like a hair trigger
Yeah.
that is always telling you that you're worthless, because that's
Not
not
the
really
go-to.
that's not really conscience telling you that. That's something else. If we feel like that we're worthless, so we're growing and we're changing. We're always loved and we're always accepted. I've learned more, I think, about the way God relates to me from me being a parent than from me being a child. I learned some about being a child and how God is like a parent. So I look at my experience with my parents and I say, oh, I learned about God through my parents. But I feel like I learned more that's helpful for the long term when I recognize how I feel about my children and the love that I have for them and how I want them to do the right thing and I want them to live healthy, vibrant lives. And I love them more than I knew that I could love somebody. And so that's the experience that God has for us. And I didn't really understand that so much until I experienced that kind of love. And we can have that with our personal relationships that we have with one another. We learn a lot about this way that God relates to us. But there is, I don't know, maybe there are times when the guilt kicks in and I go to God and say, God, I did this and I wish I hadn't, and I'm sorry, I'm going to try better.
The whole bottom line in saying I'm sorry is sincerity.
Yes.
And if you know that the person is sincere,
Yes.
and they say, and the same way with you.
Right.
If you're saying it and you're not sincere,
Right.
I'm sorry.
Right.
that's the bottom line. Yeah.
I think
To
a lot of times I'm sorry. One of the things that I learned was saying I'm sorry is really easy, but it's hard for me to admit that I'm wrong. And if I say I'm wrong, for what I did, and then doing it different, not making that same mistake again, but it's hard, and it's having humility too,
Yeah.
to own my part, own
Yeah.
what I do, what I say.
Yeah, that's some kind of a conversation with ourselves when we experience that, is like I don't want to admit that I'm wrong here. Why? Like what
Checking my motives.
what am I losing if I am wrong? Or what am I losing if I admit that they're right? Or
Yeah.
and oftentimes, maybe most of the time, it's usually some combination of we both did something, and yeah, but kind of isolating our own part. So we do have conversations with God about those shortcomings. We have conversations with ourselves. Sometimes we do need to sit down and have a conversation with ourselves. God may say, I hear you talking to me. I understand what you're saying. You need to sit and have a talk with yourself. So that's where, maybe there's some benefit in that,
And when I make an apology, sometimes I come out and say, I apologize for my actions. However, am I taking action by not repeating what caused me to apologize for? Or like, for instance, if I say to my husband, you just tracked mud all over the floor, and he looks at me and goes, oh, okay. However, the next time he comes in the house, he leaves his muddy shoes outside the front door. That's his way of apologizing without verbally saying it. So I have to remember sometimes, yes, it is hard. Maybe it's pride, where I do not verbally say, I'm sorry, I apologize. However, I'm taking action by not doing what was wrong in the first place. And then when you were saying about the shame and the guilt, I was looking through my notes from back on step 2 about am I living in a box that someone else created? Living in that box of shame and guilt. Climb out of the box.
Right.
Why am I in that box?
Right.
And
It's kind of like the other's expectations. That's kind of the box of other people's expectations. Yeah, and getting out of that box and making a decision to live in your own box of expectations. It's scary
It's
to build
hard.
your own house. to build your own house and your own expectations. And one of the reasons why it's hard is because that means you're taking on the full responsibility. If you're living under somebody else's expectations, you're not responsible for the expectations. The other person is who is setting them. So when you go out on your own and you say, okay, I'm going to expect this of myself. What are you going to do when you fall short? There's nobody there to correct you. Are we going to fall back into that mode of, well, since I don't have mom and dad yelling at me like I would if I was living under their roof, now I'm going to yell at myself. Now I'm going to shame myself. Now I'm going to, I can see that being a possibility. So it's, when we're looking at our shortcomings, we have conversations with God, we have conversations with ourselves, and when we're having conversations with other human beings, getting other human beings involved in our shortcomings, I think we should do with wisdom and with care, because we might be asking someone else to bear a burden that maybe we don't want them to bear. So we need to be, sometimes we can be so caught up in our pain, in our feeling of desperation, that we need to talk to somebody else. It's good to have somebody that you can. I'll give an example. I've shared with you that I do meet with somebody every month who's like a mentor counselor, and I know that I can share what's happening in my personal life, and it won't impact that person as much because they don't live here. They don't know anybody else in my family or group of friends or coworkers. They're not affiliated with my job or my church. They have absolutely no connection with me other than the personal connection that I have with them. And so if I share a burden with that person, they're not gonna feel it like if it were my brother, because we've got these intertwined network of relationships. Oftentimes, if I'm saying something to my brother that has impacted my life, he has a relationship with my family and with the friends that we grew up with, and our extended family, and it could be a something to bear. If I share something, when you decide to live with somebody for the rest of your life, you kind of decide to share life together, but do it carefully, the way that share your burdens carefully, because there might be some things that you and God and yourself can work out and need to work out, and you don't need to burden somebody else with it. But if you do get to a point where you kind of need a third person's opinion and perspective, that's involving another human being. In terms of saying I'm sorry, the only reason you would involve another person really would be if that's the person that you hurt, and then you are going to that person and saying, I did something, and I know, I realize that I hurt you, and I'm sorry for hurting you. And so in that way, you're confessing to another human being. And that's tough, to confess to the person that you hurt. You're confessing the person that you sinned against, essentially, But it is incredibly freeing and liberating to genuinely ask for forgiveness for somebody that you've hurt. And you're not waiting for that person to say it's okay or to accept the apology. That's not once you've made the apology, you take your hands off of the thing. You're not like, well, if you're not going to accept my apology, I take it back. They're not conditional apologies, if you say that you're sorry to somebody and the person turns around and gives you the finger, that's okay. That's on them. They're processing their own thing. And
Maybe someday they'll come back and say, I'm sorry for.
maybe they will. Yeah, maybe they will. So,
Now, an apology is really a one-way street.
yes,
Yeah, you can't expect any, you can't have any expectations when you apologize for something to
Right,
someone.
right.
You can't have any expectations.
yes,
The only expectation you can have is that, okay, it's off my chest now.
right. Now, if you want to involve another person so that you can make it as a thoroughly effective apology as possible, don't assume that you fully know the impact of what you've done to hurt the other person. You may need to ask the other person what kind of an impact that you had on them. You might say, or I might say, when I said this to you, I could see it in your eyes that I hurt you, and if I had stopped to think about it, I would not have said those things, and I regret it, and I'm very sorry for saying those things and hurting you. And I can imagine that, I'm not really sure how I hurt you, but I'm very sorry. If you want to tell me what it is, how I've hurt you, you can, but you don't require it of a person. If a person is grateful for you apologizing and they want to help you to understand when you use that term, this is what I think, that's a chance for healing. If the person accepts the apology and is open to trust, this can be hard to receive, because oftentimes we kind of want to give an apology and kind of like be in control of what we're apologizing for. And if a person comes back and says, it's a lot worse than you think, then it's like, ooh, I guess I need to apologize for that too.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize that, and I'm so sorry. So,
I don't think it'd really be, I don't think it'd be effective to ask the person, if you want to tell me how this hurt you, it'd be fine. I think it'd be more on the other person, that if they really felt they needed to tell you, they would tell you. But for you to ask for them, I don't know.
well, you wouldn't insist on it, because then you're kind of asking somebody else to be vulnerable with you after you just hurt them.
Yeah.
Can I just say, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
My understanding and how I'm reading this, we're kind of talking about steps 8 and 9 right now, making amends. And the 5th step to me is about, admitting, looking at myself and sharing it with God and another human being, the exact nature of my wrongs. And that is somebody that I trust. And I'm letting them know, I'm looking at me and everything that I can think of that I've done, and that I'm just admitting it, and I'm not at the point yet where I'm like, oh, I'm okay with what I'm going to do with it. Now where do I go with it? I know I'm jumping the gun here, but
No, I can,
I mean, we're having
I
dealt
can
with
see
our
where you're
shortcomings
going.
yet.
Yeah,
That's getting
yeah.
through this, then we're dealing with our defects and our shortcomings, and then after that, we're looking at, do I
they all, yeah, they're all the steps are kind of interconnected and attached in some way.
They are.
And I can see how this is focused on our shortcomings. Does it tend to focus on like patterns instead of individuals?
That has always been my understanding, or, that it was like, for me to do that inventory was for me to maybe look back and see what I wrote, putting it, paper to pen. It's easier than doing it here sometimes.
When a person does the inventory, are they pinpointing particular shortcomings, or is it more like?
From my experience, no, because I don't know anything about shortcomings yet. I'm just kind of being told, write down as much as you can about your life and what you did, and I might not know why I did it, but then somebody who could be more objective with me, this person that I'm trusting, can maybe look and see the patterns and help me to see the patterns. And then out of that, I pick, okay, well, because of your patterns, you know, maybe you're, you know, you really feel, you know, you don't have a lot of self-esteem, or you don't feel, or you're controlling, or you're not controlling, or, you know, a people pleaser, you need, why did I do these things, you know, for attention or for negative attention, and then going from there, maybe making a list of, this is just what I was taught, now I've done it, my defects, what I could identify.
So defects is something that you're consistently falling short on.
Yes, because I
Like-
could maybe act out.
Like,
my
I
defect and
keep
be fine.
lying, I keep lying,
Yeah.
I keep yelling,
Yeah.
I keep doing this.
Why do I react the way that I do? Why did I deal with that the way that I did? And then from there, like, oh, well, maybe I need to make amends to this person. Or, you know, it's like making a list. I might not be willing to do it, but I'll make a list of the people
Right.
that,
So
that's-
this person in this step that we're going to is not the person that was offended.
Not from my experience.
This is like your confessor. This is your,
Yeah,
your,
like the steps are in order for a
your
reason,
mentor.
and that's why we go, you know.
yeah.
But yeah, I see what you're saying. It is easy to like look at all of it and try to jump in with all of it. But I think depending on, from my experience with addiction, you
Yeah.
know, trying to do it all at once is maybe too much, or I wouldn't understand it or be able to get through it.
Well, that is the tricky part about the way that we're doing these 12 steps, is that usually most groups are focused on one particular shortcoming that everyone shares. You know, it's Liars Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous.
Right.
It's a particular defect of choice, or of the default that comes back. I would imagine, yeah.
And
Yeah,
again, that's just my experience, and I really, you know, I'm getting a lot more out of this because it is a little broader. It's different. you
Yeah.
know, Right. And there's
Yeah.
a lot of good stuff in here. I'm just thinking we're going to be repeating what we're saying, but maybe not, and maybe that's okay.
no, it's good. It's good to, this is defect centered, whereas 8 and 9 are focused on in particular experiences with another person and making amends for that, or maybe how a relationship went sour, or something like that. Right.
Real quickly, the different ways that I've worked the fourth step, which that I would share, like as a fifth step with that trusted individual, was look at my liabilities. Times that I got that I was angry, that I was fearful, relationships. And then after I wrote about my liabilities, I also wrote about my assets, because it's an inventory of me. And then another way that I had done it at another time was when you were saying about the 7 deadly sins, I looked at the 7 deadly sins and how I acted out on those with different relationships and people in my life. And then some people do it with the 10 Commandments too. You know, there's all different ways to do it, and not that there's a right or a wrong.
To do the inventory?
Right, to do the inventory.
That's
You know,
good.
The main thing is that I'm honest and I'm
Right.
thorough, and I ask God for that direction and guidance before I start writing. And
Right.
of course, before I go with my trusted person.
Good. I like that. Thank you for those. Thank you for those. All right, so let me just take a second. I know we went way over today.
Just a minute or two.
So bookmark that one. Okay, we're getting real close
To step 6?
The end of the chapter.
to step 6. Yeah.
Whoa. We've obviously missed something.
Yeah, just a couple more quotes, so we're getting there. All right. Let's do our
Send
sending
us
song.
out.
Send us out in the power of your Spirit, Lord.